It was 100 years ago that Pinellas County was established. In this series, people will tell its story in their own words and remember how it all began.
The history of the sponge diving industry in Tarpon Springs started back probably in the late 1800s. Originally, the divers that came here from Greece came in 1905. It was the Greeks that brought the diving suit and that way of bringing the sponge up to the surface. Prior to that, in Tarpon Springs, what you had was Bahamian immigrants and African Americans who were here in Tarpon that were bringing a sponge up using a small rowboat and a hook or a prong, a long prong, and they called them hookers. So the industry at that time with the hooking was very small. They were just eking out a meager existence with that. John Chaney, who realized that there was money to be made, came to Tarpon and then started to build up the industry. He then brought John Kokoris from New York. Mr. Kokoris was originally from Leonidon, Greece. He brought him to Tarpon Springs, and Mr. Kokoris was instrumental in bringing the divers from Greece, namely Kalimnos, which was the main island. There were several other islands in the Dodecanese. There was Simi, Halki. There's another island that's just off the mainland of Greece of Aegina. A lot of divers came from there also. At one point, there were over 500 divers and deckhands, cooks, people who were involved in the industry that came to Tarpon Springs. A little bit about the diving part of it. In 1865, the diving suit was invented. It was a German invention. From there, the Greeks caught on. Before the Greeks in the Dodecanese Islands used the diving suits, they used to skin dive. Naked. They would dive, go down, holding on to what they called a scandalopetra, which was basically a translation is a bell stone. It was about a 30-pound stone. They held on to it, and it would take them down to the bottom. They'd gather up as many sponges as they could, and then come back up to the top. Now, when the diving suit came into existence, they didn't know much about bottom time, didn't know much about decompression sickness. So between about 1886 and 1910, there were over 10,000 deaths attributed to decompression sickness from the use of the suit. Another 20,000 paralysis and permanent paralysis and injuries from decompression sickness, which was again attributed to the dive suit. And again, only because they knew nothing about decompression sickness or bottom times and that kind of thing. In 1882, the woman of the Dodecanese went to the Turkish Sultan, because at that time Greece was still under Turkish rule. They went to the Turkish Sultan and asked him to outlaw the use of the suit and save the lives of their men. So they did for about 4 years. But during that time, production of sponge dropped, and all the people who were involved in the industry, they were losing money. So the suit came back. After the early 1900s, then they came up with the dive tables and bottom times and knew what they had to do in order to avoid getting the bends. So that's when it took off, and it took off here in Tarpon. Tarpon soon became the sponge capital of the world. Now, at some point, there were Greeks who were down in Key West, and there was a bitter rivalry down in Key West between the Greeks and the inhabitants of the Keys, which they called themselves the Conchs. The Conchs believed that in preserving the sponge and only hooking it, and of course the Greeks wanted to gather sponge by diving for it. More sponge by diving. So this is where the rivalry began. So eventually a lot of Greeks left Key West and came to Tarpon. And that's, again, like I said, that's where Tarpon took off, the sponge industry took off in Tarpon, and it went strong for many, many years. In the 30s, 40s, they started to get a little blighted. Red tide wiped out the harbors. A lot of the sponge, and they couldn't harvest as many as they had been in the past. But for the most part, Tarpon was known as the sponge capital of the world, and still today, they're still going strong, even with the few boats that are there. A lot of the boats that you see at the sponge docks today are boats that have been fishing boats and pleasure craft that have been converted to diving boats. The original sponge diving boat, the traditional Greek sponge diving boat that they used to dive off of in Greece, has a long history. Goes back nearly 3,000 years. Started out with the Greeks, of course, and then it went from the Greeks, then the Romans, the Byzantines, the Turks, the Italians, Dalmatian pirates, and even Spanish mercenaries used this particular hull design or a design similar to it over the period of years. And it's proven itself as being the most seaworthy boat for the Aegean and Mediterranean use. Now, going back to the Dalmatians, the Dalmatian pirates were along the Adriatic coast, the eastern Adriatic coast, what is now known as Croatia. They basically had a stronghold on anyone who wanted to go up the Adriatic to Venice, which was at the time very, very heavily commercialized there. And they had, anyone who wanted to come and go to Venice had to pay those pirates to get in and out of the Adriatic or suffer the consequences. Around the 17th century, the design that the Dalmatian pirates used, which they refer to as the trabaculo, was again readapted by the Greeks, made some changes. They took it, made some changes, and then it became the Greek traditional sponge diving boat. The Greeks call it, even to this day, a trichandiri, which is derived from the Byzantine word trochandiron, which basically means a curved bow stem, as you'll see right here. Now, in Greece, they still build these boats. However, there's one difference to the ones that we build here in the United States. They're double enders. In other words, the bow and the stern both have come to a point. The last major change that was made to that hull design was here in Tarpon Springs. They cut off that point at the end. Actually didn't cut it off, they basically opened it up and added a transom to it. That was to allow for the bigger diesel engines that we're putting in them, gave them more deck space and more room to service or work down below in the holds working on the engine, in the engine room. And it's been that way. The last sponge boat that was built in Tarpon Springs, the last wooden hull sponge boat, was built around in the early 80s. That boat was then used to make a mold. From that mold, they made a fiberglass hull, and that fiberglass hulled sponge boat is still in use today. It's called the Anasazi, and it's owned by the diver Testaros. And it's still in use, still working today, and it'll probably be around a long time after we're gone. The mold that was built by the boat builder George Saroukas here in town was destroyed due to heavy rains. It filled up with water and couldn't hold it, so it collapsed. And that was the last Greek sponge boat that was made in Tarpon Springs. The sponge boats themselves now that were built in Greece and here in Tarpon Springs for years, basically the structure was a very stout structure. As I said before, they proved themselves in the Aegean as being very seaworthy. They weren't the fastest boats, but you could depend on them. I can't speak for what the builders did in Greece, but what they did here in Tarpon, I think for the most part the boats were built out of Cyprus. Okay? And the big difference between a sponge diving boat and most boats that you'll see, commercial fishing boats and that kind of thing, is they're very wide, and they have an extreme curve in the bow and along the deck line. And the fact that they're wide basically accommodates the waters, keeps it from rolling too much and dipping. As far as the yards, the boat yards here in Tarpon, there were quite a few boat yards in Tarpon, but there were also boat yards in Fernandina Beach, Florida, and also in Apalachicola, and these were all owned by Greeks. For the most part, most of them built these boats by eye. They knew how much lumber they needed. They ordered the lumber, and they would just get to work and start building them. Very few of them had plans, because most of these men were raised in a boatyard. They knew what they were doing. They learned from their grandfathers, from their fathers, and then they carried on the trade themselves. And when they came here, they continued that same tradition of building the boats. Of course, your typical sponge boat carried a crew of anywhere from 3 to 6 men. The more divers you had, the better off you were, because, as we said before, decompression sickness. You can only stay underwater so long, and you can only have so many dives in one day. Well, when one man is through, you get your second diver in, and if you found a good spot, they want to continue to keep bringing the sponge up. They don't want to lose that spot. Of course, they also, sponge boat carried the compressor, which in the early years was hand-driven. You had a man who manned that air compressor, and his job was very important. Otherwise there's going to be trouble. A lot of times fights broke out on deck because somebody wasn't paying attention, and when a diver came up and he knew you were messing around, or he wasn't getting his air the way he should, there was trouble. A lot of times they would get in arguments. Divers would leave as soon as they made port somewhere, whether it was Cedar Key, Steinhatchee, down in the Keys, the Everglades. They'd jump off the boat and head back to Tarpon, or get on, sign on with somebody else who might happen to be in the area. Soon after the industry had started going strong here in Tarpon, they realized that they needed somewhere to store the sponge until the auction days. So they built the Sponge Exchange. Basically, it was a building where you you walked into the entrance, and you were surrounded by what they call coluvis. They were cages, basically. The sponge boat captains had their sponge stored in there till auction day. It was a huge courtyard, and on auction day, all the sponges would be brought out of the cages and in the middle of the courtyard, and then the bidders would come in and start bidding on the sponge themselves. The Sponge Exchange was eventually, for the most part, revamped or demolished. Most of it had been demolished around the early 1980s. It had become pretty weather-beaten and old, and quite frankly, it was a little too expensive for the city to try and rebuild it and maintain it. There are some of the original cages that have been left intact. I know a couple of them, some shop owners are actually working out of them, which is kind of neat, because at least you have that small piece of history. But the rest of it has been turned into small shops. As far as the people in Tarpon, of course, it was the sponge industry that brought the Greeks here. Before the Greeks came, though, Tarpon Springs was an Anglo settlement, and those people, in their own rights, had a huge contribution to the town. It was a big resort town. And then when the Greeks came, of course, it turned from a sleepy little resort town to a very colorful, very flavorful community with the Greeks and their culture. St. Nicholas Church, the original St. Nicholas Church, I'm told, was near the bayou, just right outside these doors here. Yeah. And it had burned down at one point. So then St. Nicholas was built at the corner of Orange Street and Pinellas Avenue. When that church was built, the church board took up contributions from all the divers, the captains, deckhands. Every week they would contribute a little bit of their pay in order to build that church. In return, the church gave everyone who contributed a lifetime membership to the church, to them and their families, their immediate families, which I thought was always very nice. And we still enjoy that because my father was a diver. The restaurants, always wonderful restaurants down there. I don't think there's a restaurant down there that you can get a bad meal in. They're all my favorites. So, and as far as going back to the boats themselves, when the sponge boats were being built here, at one point there were over 150 boats in the river. You could literally walk across the Anclote River from one side to the other, stepping on one sponge boat after another, after another, after another. Originally, a lot of the sponge boats that were being built here were being built as double enders. Okay, and then, as I said earlier, eventually they started to change, and they added the transom to it, and that was, like I said before, the last change that they had made here. Every year on January the 6th, the Greek church celebrates the baptism of Christ on Epiphany Day. And on that day, church starts very early, and young men from around the community have signed up to dive for the cross that day. I'm told that diving for the cross, the significance of it, or the meaning of diving for the cross, is being man's search for the truth, and that's one of the things that we do here that draws a lot of people to town. In the early years, and even going back to Greece, any man could dive of any age. They didn't care if you were 10 years old or 90 years old. If you wanted to dive, you could dive for the cross. Unfortunately, over time, here in town, in Tarpon Springs, they had to set an age limit. Now, my first year diving, there were grown men diving with me, and it's a free-for-all. When you're diving for that cross, it is a free-for-all. You have to be a good swimmer, good diver, and be able to have eyes in the back of your head, because no offense, it's strictly, I'm going to get the cross. I don't care who I have to walk on to get it. Over the years, as I said, they had to set an age limit, and now I believe it's between the ages of 15 and 18, and it's always a great day to get out and see the cross throwing in Tarpon Springs. The young man that retrieves the cross is blessed by the Archbishop, and supposedly has good luck for the rest of the year. Although a lot of boys have luck for their entire lives. I mean, it's a good thing in our religion, it's a good thing to have retrieved the cross in Tarpon Springs. Another one of the things in Tarpon that we celebrate big, and actually, is Greek Easter. Now, Greek Easter is usually celebrated on a different day than the Catholic Easter. Greek Orthodox Easter, sometimes they fall on the same weekend, and I'm not sure exactly what calendar they go by or what it is that they use to judge what day Greek Easter will be on, but when we celebrate it, it's usually the entire week, Holy Week, leading up to Holy Friday. There's church. Thursday night at the church, people will go and you will stay up all night, and this is the night that Christ was supposedly hung on the cross. On Friday night is the night that they carry the epitaphio, or the body of Christ. They will walk out the doors of the church and go usually about 2 city blocks square around and come back into the church. At that time, all young men, or any man who wants to, can take a hand and carry what they call the epitaphio of the body of Christ. And it's supposed to be like a blessing to be able to do that. Also, they carry a cross as they carry the epitaphio, and men trade time holding a cross up and walking it around the church. One of the traditions that we have that we brought back from Greece is the fireworks at midnight. At midnight on Saturday night, when Christ has risen, that's when supposedly Christ has risen, the Archbishop will yell out, Christos Anesti, which means Christ has risen. And at that time, the fireworks go off. Now, the significance of the fireworks, as I said, was a tradition carried back from Greece. In the early days of Greece, they started by cracking whips. And that was the noise that they would make in order to alert people, to let everyone know that Christ has risen. It evolved into fireworks. Of course, I don't know much about the old days before my time. All I know is things were when my father was a diver. He learned to dive at a very young age. He was probably around 12 or 13. Before he became a diver, he worked with my grandfather on a hook boat. Now, my grandfather had come here in the early 1900s, just before the First World War. He went off to war and fought in the First World War. He was drafted by the U.S. Army. And when he came back, he continued with the diving. Eventually, my grandfather had lost his leg and was an amputee, so he could no longer dive, so he went to hook sponging. And he would take my father or one of my other two. I had four uncles. There were three uncles, and then my father, my Uncle Mike, and my Uncle Manuel were the only three that were involved in the sponge diving. So Dad would row for my grandfather while he hooked a sponge looking through a glass-bottom bucket. He thought that was a little boring. So being a rambunctious young man, he quit. He left my grandfather stranded somewhere. He came back to Tarpon and got on a sponge boat to start working as a diver. The gentleman that taught my father to dive was Philip Fatalitas, and Philip just recently passed away. He was the last of the hard hat divers, the divers that went down wearing that big brass helmet, brass and copper helmet. He taught my dad how to dive. They became good friends over the years. Philip Fatalitas was one of the best divers in the area. My father had a great reputation as being one of the best divers. He was a little hot-headed at times, but he was a good diver. Another name that comes to mind is John Mailis. They called him the Greek. He was an excellent diver. All these men were good friends. Another gentleman, actually a relative of mine, Tony Hulis. Unfortunately, Mr. Hulis had passed away in the mid-70s. He drowned while he was diving. There was an accident on board, and he drowned, and he didn't make it. Also, Mr. George Jimenez, which was also a close family friend. He had come over from Greece, a good friend of my father's, a darn good diver. All these men had good reputations. And there are others out there that I can't remember their names right now, but I don't think that there was a bad diver out there, because I mean, if you wanted to be a diver, you had to be good at it. So, you know, there were no mediocre divers. They were all good men, and they all worked hard, and they all worked for their families. And as my father used to say, every time I saw a sponge, this is for Johnny, this is for my daughter, this is for my other son. You know, that's the mentality that they had. They were for the family. And that was the basis of the Greek community.
The sponge diving industry and the Greek community in Tarpon Springs is just a part of the rich history of Pinellas County. We hope you have enjoyed this program and learned a little more about the history of Pinellas County. Watch for more programs in this centennial series. Thank you for watching.